Welcome to the Age of Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. Our dedication to living life joyfully allows us to confront the reality of unmitigated deception and political denial of the harm caused by nuclear and chemical contamination. We demand an end to corporate control of science and suppression of facts for political and financial gain. We are not assets on a balance sheet. We must honestly work together to remediate damage to benefit our planet and humanity. Remember, happiness is resistance, and love is greater than fear. Join the Age of Fission radio show on Spreaker.com. Search for Lonnie Clark for all our podcasted shows. Podcasts are also on YouTube at Nutzforart, Nutzforart. Thank you for being part of the solution. Good evening. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. I want to thank you for joining us. I am extremely delighted to have with us the Healthy Climate Program Director from Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, or Oregon PSR, I guess that's what they call it, Mr. Damon Motz-Storey. Damon, thank you for joining us. I'm super excited. I used to interview Chuck Johnson all the time on my radio show. I think he had a similar place within the organization, and he moved back east, and I ended up reaching out to PSR again and talking to you because you are really instrumental in helping change the conversation here in the Northwest about the use of nuclear and not nuclear. So welcome to our show.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be on.
Well, look, I really wanted to ask you about the work that you're doing, about the broader work that you're doing. So why don't you inform our listeners a little bit about PSR for those people who don't know about it and some of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I would love to. So Physicians for Social Responsibility is a nationwide organization with chapters in a bunch of different parts of the country and a national headquarters in Washington, D.C. that focuses on federal issues. And the statewide chapters, including Oregon PSR, focus on federal issues that pertain to Oregon, but also state and local and regional issues as well. So we focus in on things that are affecting sort of upstream public health issues in Oregon and Washington. And we have been historically one of the leading nuclear disarmament advocacy groups. So back in the heyday of the nuclear freeze movement and in the midst of the Cold War, when things were really looking dire in terms of the threat of nuclear weapons usage, PSR was one of the leading voices calling for disarmament and nuclear sanity. And in the years that have passed since then, PSR has continued to be a strong voice of advocacy for nuclear disarmament, but has also begun to incorporate other issue areas that are very effective of public health on a wide scale. So we look at sort of the gravest threats to health and survival, whether that be the threat of nuclear war or the climate catastrophe caused by global warming, or widespread environmental health or militaristic threats to survival. So that's where we are now as an organization. Mm-hmm. And Oregon PSR has about 2,000 members statewide, not just health professionals, but also people who are just concerned about public health and the issues that we work on.
So you're a 501(c)(3). People can contribute to your organization.
Yes, and donations are always welcome because it helps us to advance the work of our organization.
Exactly. So one of the things I was very excited when I reached out to you to hear is that you are actually really working very diligently to keep the conversation open about how nuclear power is not part of the green, clean machine that we want to implement.
That's right. I'm so glad you asked this question. So you mentioned Chuck Johnson, who used to work for Oregon PSR. And after he left the organization, I really took on his work plan of advocating both for the decommissioning of our existing nuclear power capacity in the Northwest and also against the building of new nuclear power infrastructure. And that has been something that I've been working on in very close coordination with our climate efforts as well. And as you said, many people in the energy advocacy world think that nuclear power is maybe something that is not a super exciting or super great solution, but that it's preferable to fossil fuels. And so one of the most important areas of work that I've been focusing on is trying to help to educate and inform people on why nuclear power is an unacceptable form of energy to be moving to from fossil fuels, and that we need to move beyond both fossil fuels and nuclear power.
And we can do it concurrently. They don't have to be one after the other. I had kind of an argument with the Natural Resource Defense Fund out of New York when they were working with the Illinois legislature to keep 2 leaking nuclear power facilities open because they wanted to continue their work to shut down the coal plants.
Right. And I think a much better case study to look at is in Diablo Canyon in California, where labor, environmental, and utility groups came together and established an agreement where they would replace nuclear power with renewable energy at that site. And so it really, that to me stands as a brilliant case study on how it is not only possible, but actually advantageous to merge those goals together.
You know, this is a question, and I didn't discuss this with you, but I have it occurs to me that where the Columbia Generating Station sits in the Columbia Gorge, we could set up wind power and probably generate as much, if not more, electricity from the wind power than we could out of the Columbia Generating Station. Am I correct in that?
Yes, absolutely. And solar power is also a really good option in that region as well. So I'll just do a quick primer for anybody who's not familiar with the geography of where the Columbia Generating Station is. So Columbia Generating Station is the Pacific Northwest's final remaining commercial nuclear power plant. It's the only one currently operating in the state of Washington, and it sits on leased land from the U.S. Department of Energy's Hanford site, where all of the nuclear production for nuclear weapons during World War II and the Cold War occurred. So what you have here is this 1,200 megawatt nuclear power plant that is sitting on the Hanford nuclear site and producing more nuclear waste at a site that is already one of the most contaminated in the world. And the geography of eastern Washington is it's a high desert. There's a lot of big open sweeping plains with not too many trees, not too many forests, and an enormous amount of sunshine, much more than the western side of the Cascades. And so this region is actually really ideal for both wind and solar energy, and it already is connected into the Pacific Northwest electrical grid because it's along the Columbia River where all of the Bonneville dams are already connected into our electricity grid.
That's pretty fascinating. So this is something also, though, I think people don't understand about the Columbia Generating Station. It's what I call the proximity factor. I've spoken to Ron Wyden and Jeff Merkley and Pete DeFazio about this. Because the Columbia Generating Station is less than 13 miles, I think it's 12.1 miles away from the Hanford tanks, some of those Hanford tanks, when there is an earthquake, and this is the interesting thing, that study from the Earth Journal in 2014 discovered those earthquake faults that surround the Hanford Station and the Columbia Generating Station. When that happens, if the earthquake causes even a small nuclear meltdown at Columbia Generating Station, nobody would be able to get into the Hanford tanks for 2 weeks because there's a 25-mile exclusion zone because you will die if you go in there. And so what will happen is some of those tanks might explode into a fire that will go on for 700,000 years, a long, 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 long time. I mean, it is at a very... I talked to Tom Carpenter about this. I kind of threw this... He's like, in theory, that could actually... It's a high probability that could happen because some of those tanks do need to be churned and maintained 24 hours a day to keep from being... They're so explosive.
Right. So, yeah, and in the case of the actual nuclear power reactor being in that exclusion zone, if there was any sort of major accident or issue that caused the evacuation of the Hanford site, getting at the Columbia Generating Station to maintain it and make sure it doesn't suffer its own catastrophe would be very difficult to do. So, yeah, the proximity is definitely an issue.
It is.
And also the fact that the reactor is itself along very, potentially volatile earthquake fault lines and sits along the Columbia River, which is, an important recreation, fishing, and drinking water source for communities throughout Oregon and Washington.
Damon, what kind of success have you had in communicating with other environmental groups that nuclear is not clean or green?
Great question. Yeah. So this has been, a very long-term unfolding conversation, but the mainstream environmental and climate movements are very, very concerned about drawing down the parts per million of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere in order to address the climate crisis, as well they should be. And because it is absolutely gearing up to be one of the biggest human health catastrophes that the world has ever seen. So this is absolutely a noble and worthy goal to be drawing down the amount of greenhouse gases that have been created by human activities and getting that out of the atmosphere and stopping the production of new greenhouse gas emissions. However, there are some groups that have been so laser focused on the notion of just eliminating carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that there have been some what I call clean energy imposters that have been entertained as potential positive solutions by mainstream environmental groups that really just continue to create their own public health issues on the ground where they are installed. So nuclear power is sort of the biggest example of this, right, of a very expensive energy source that still uses the same dig, burn, and dump model of fossil fuels, except that instead of coal, oil, or gas, it's uranium that then goes into reactors and then gets dumped in the form of nuclear waste that, as you mentioned, remains volatile and dangerous to be exposed to for, way longer than any of our lifespans or any of our great-great-great-grandchildren's lifespans. So that's really where PSR comes in as a compelling messenger on this issue, because we look at this from a human health perspective and from a public health perspective, and we make sure that it's very well known that you can't just sacrifice one public health crisis for the other, right? So we need to have sort of a unified look at both, reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we have, but also making sure that we don't create sacrifice zones, zones that get their health sacrificed in the process.
I also, whenever I talk to these people that have that argument about, well, we need to close the coal and the fossil fuel chain, and it's not that bad, I remind them that the life cycle of actually maintaining the waste products uses gazillions amounts of fossil fuels in perpetuity.
Right. The management of nuclear waste is a highly energy intensive process. Yes. So the bottom line is that we just don't have to be picking between one or the other.
Right.
We can be working to close down coal and fracked gas power plants while we simultaneously work to close nuclear power plants throughout the country. And in fact, when we start to look at the timeline of our carbon reduction goals as a country, you may have heard it kind of got very famous, this line about how we have less than 12 years to eliminate half of our carbon emissions in order to meet our world climate goals. Well, in the next 12 years, we are going to see a lot more nuclear plant closures. And the concept of actually building new nuclear power plants in that time frame is pretty laughable, because when you look at the history of the nuclear power industry in recent decades, most every one of the new projects that have been proposed in the United States have been far over budget and way behind schedule. And so I often will tell in mainstream environmental groups that even if you do accept nuclear power as a part of your solution, it's actually highly impractical for meeting those that timeline of carbon reduction goals because of how expensive and how time intensive it is to get new major nuclear power projects off the ground. But moreover, and more importantly, the moral issue of adding any additional nuclear power capacity to our electricity grid is far too great to ignore. So those are some of the issues that I try to lift up in my work with mainstream environmental organizations.
Well, how do you counter this idea? Because, we have these, NuScale came up with these small nuclear reactors, which really aren't small when you look at the overall project. But how do you counter that with this new idea that, I actually had a U of O student tell me that I was incorrect, that scientists have actually figured out a way to remediate the nuclear waste, and that the small nuclear reactors that are being built will actually resolve the issue of nuclear waste.
Right. Well, so that's simply not true. So I'll back up here and give just a little bit of a primer for any listeners who aren't aware. But there's an Oregon-based company called NuScale Power, which is working to develop a research and design for a small modular nuclear reactor project that is being proposed for the Idaho National Laboratory site in southern Idaho. And if this project were built, it would sell its electricity to the U.S. Department of Energy and to the Utah Associated Municipal Power Systems, which is a collection of small publicly owned utilities in the Utah, Idaho, and Oregon area. So essentially, this project, if it were built, would add 12 modules of 50 megawatt nuclear power generators of a type that has never been successfully created anywhere in the world. And they're making all kinds of claims that this would be far preferable to a conventional nuclear reactor, in part because each individual nuclear reactor would make less radioactive waste than a conventional reactor. But the only reason why that's true is that they are smaller reactors with a smaller power output. And when you actually look at the amount of waste created per megawatt of electricity generated, these small modular reactor designs actually create more nuclear waste per megawatt of electricity generated than a conventional nuclear power reactor. So it's simply not true to say that these small nuclear reactor designs would actually solve our nuclear waste issues. If anything, it would just make it worse.
That is incredible. I did not know that it was actually it created more waste. That's because the theory that I had heard is that each one of these, they're going to have like a launching pad, like the space that they're going to give, and they're going to build 12 small reactors or 9 small reactors per site, and they will build them as they needed, right? But
right.
That doesn't actually add up. The logic of it doesn't actually add up when you think about, especially considering the Columbia Generating Station really only provides 4 to 7%, no more than, I don't think very many places produce more than 10% of the nuclear need, of the energy needs being provided, right?
Yes, nationwide, nuclear power generates about 20% of the U.S. energy grid. And in many places, you're right. It's usually, and in the Northwest, that's certainly true. Any customers of a municipal or publicly owned utility in the Pacific Northwest are usually getting their electricity from the Bonneville Power Administration, which markets the Columbia Generating Station's electricity, as well as the hydroelectric generation that happens on the Columbia River. And the distribution of what electricity comes from where is less than 10% nuclear for all of those publicly owned utilities. So if you're a Seattle City Light customer, if you live in the city of Seattle and you plug something in, about 10% of those electrons going into your mobile phone or whatever would be nuclear power generated.
Mm-hmm. I know here in Eugene, I think it said that we're like 4%. That's what we get. So, but this is my question, like when the resistance to close the nuclear power plants doesn't really come from the public, I think. It really comes from the industry, correct?
Absolutely. And especially when you look at public opinion polling around nuclear power, a lot of people are very skeptical of it and not big proponents of it. Largely, what I am experiencing is I'm seeing a lot of nuclear power industries trying to lobby for and influence conversations around clean energy production in order to try to carve out some amount of the subsidy money that gets generated by, for example, any kind of carbon fee program or any kinds of attempts to bring new public funding and state dollars for clean energy production. The nuclear industry wants to try to access those dollars because it's not penciling out for them to generate nuclear power on their own. And so they're looking for any opportunity that they can get to subsidize nuclear power generation. And the more that the nuclear industry is able to market nuclear as a clean fuel, the more likely they are to be able to be eligible for public subsidies that are meant to address the climate catastrophe, right? So that's one of the biggest and most dangerous things that we can be looking at from the nuclear industry right now is they're trying to make themselves a part of the clean energy economy. But what they're doing is anything but clean, as downwinders can tell you.
Let me ask you a question, and I didn't actually talk to you about this one either, but it's a question that popped in my head because I, like many people, have this idea that the nuclear waste, the product that comes out of the Columbia Generating Station, for example, some of that nuclear waste, the byproduct, what they call waste, it's actually a byproduct because you can't just throw it away, so it's not really waste. The byproduct that sits in these nuclear fuel rods is actually usable for nuclear weapons. Do you know if that's correct?
I'm going to admit that I'm really not well versed in what different kinds of nuclear waste or byproducts can be used for. I do know that there are a lot of processes out there that are meant to sort of repurpose nuclear waste in ways that can then allow it to be reused as fuel or used as fissile material in some cases. I have definitely heard about this as well, but I admit that I'm not well versed in it.
I'm going to keep searching.
The bottom line. Yeah, the bottom line is that regardless of whether you can reuse nuclear waste for nuclear weapons or additional power generation, there's a limit to how much you can do that, right? There's no way to keep on using something forever. And we certainly, the last thing we need is for production of additional nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And so, the bottom line there is that even if you can recycle some amount of nuclear waste, you're still working with something that is going to be dangerous to human health for longer than human society will likely exist.
So let me ask you this. Do you think that the effort to keep the nuclear industry alive and well and thriving, like I know President Obama handed NuScale a $35 million check the first week after that guy, Mr. Reyes, graduated the Oregon State University. There's a huge push inside government to prop up. In fact, President Trump signed an executive agreement in the last year that said the United States government is going to support the nuclear industry. That I don't know if you're
right,
but so
yeah.
The question is, are they just beating a dead horse, or is it just because they know that it's a few people like Bechtel and the people that run these big mega war profiteering machines are basically the same people that are running our nuclear power facilities, Entergy, they're all connected to the war profiteering machine. Do you think it's just that they see it as a cash cow and that they know the inevitability of it closing down and they're fighting hard to keep it going?
Yes, I think that's absolutely the major contributor to why the nuclear industry is still trying to grasp at any life support it can possibly find. The market does not favor nuclear power.
Right.
It's not an economical source of generating electricity, and it never has been. And it only is getting more so uneconomical because most of our infrastructure is getting older, and we are not really seeing a lot of actual demand for new nuclear power generation resources. So, to look at this question, I think you kind of have to go back to the very dawn of the American nuclear age in the 1940s, right? We were sold a false narrative about needing nuclear weapons in order to end World War II. And the sort of resultant patriotism around the nuclear industry buoyed up an energy industry into a position of sort of this mythological necessity. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that the U.S. government sort of equated nuclear energy and nuclear weapons as both vital national security defenders, right? Because having nuclear weapons, or so the mythology goes, is making us safer, right? Because it's actually deterring war. And, you know, at the same time, nuclear energy is making us less dependent on importing fossil fuels from other countries, right? So all of this was being, you know, the same playbook was being used in both nuclear weapons and nuclear power. And so what we have to work on is making sure people understand that that's outdated, right? That's no longer, that's it. If it was ever true that we needed nuclear power to be less dependent on foreign imports of oil, for example, I would say that we could have used renewable energy instead, right? It's certainly no longer true now, right? Especially because there's been all sorts of increases in U.S. developed energy, right? And we just don't need it anymore, right? So there's certainly that. And then there's certainly also just needing to continue to disconnect nuclear power from the U.S. government's desire to, you know, mythologize it as a national security defender. And so I would say that is absolutely where the nuclear industry is coming from on this, is riding on the coattails of decades of historical favoritism for nuclear power because it was so connected in with this sense of patriotism around ending World War II and keeping us safe, et cetera, right? So that's certainly where it's coming from with the federal government. And then I think what we're seeing in recent years here is the nuclear industry's attempt to try to get state governments to support it because of climate goals, right? And so there's sort of two different sides of the coin that need to be addressed.
I also think, what do you think of this idea? I've thought, you know, the licenses, like Columbia Generating Station, even though it's in a negative, from what I understand, its financials are in the negative, and it's mandated to close if it's not profitable, it continues to get its license renewed. But I think that these continual renewals of their licenses by the NRC, which is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they really haven't seen a license renewal application that they've turned down. I mean, very, very few. But I think they're kicking the can down the road because they know once you close this nuclear power facility, you've got a whole other set of issues that you have to deal with. You're going to have spent nuclear fuel that just sits in the community that while people are getting electricity, they're not thinking about it because they're getting electricity. But once the plant closes down, then they're like, well, we don't want this stuff sitting here, and there's no place to put it.
Then you only have a liability and no benefit. Exactly.
Right. And so I think that's part of the push of why it's kind of like they just don't want to admit they made a very grave mistake. I mean, thank goodness for John Goffman, because they really did want to put over 300 nuclear power facilities in our country. That was the original idea. So Helen Caldicott, who founded Physicians for Social Responsibility, in her push, really actually did. They made to me, honestly, Helen Caldicott is one of our great heroes for humanity, because she and others that were working with her stopped the governments from putting nuclear facilities all over the place.
Right. I'm so glad you brought up the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the licensing, because that's one of the biggest outrages of this whole situation, is that many of the nuclear industry insiders are just completely in bed with the people that are supposed to be objectively regulating them, right? So it's not that unique in the American political world for that sort of a situation to be happening, unfortunately. But I would say, as far as the Nuclear Regulatory Commission goes, it's one of the most brazen examples of that.
And it's dangerous.
It's absolutely true, right? And what we've seen is actually former Nuclear Regulatory Commission folks have spoken out quite publicly about being very discomforted by that dynamic. Now let's focus in on the Columbia Generating Station. So when CGS first opened in the 1980s, it was given an operating license by the NRC of 40 years. And then when that 40 years started to get close to being over, they received a license renewal of another 40 years from the NRC. And so that's what we're currently in right now is they are in the second half of their 80-year licensing contract with that renewal. The issue is that a General Electric boiling water reactor of its type, right, because that's what kind of nuclear reactor it is, has never in the history of the United States operated for longer than about 51 or 52 years. So we've got a plant where a bunch of the utility players are expecting it to last until the year 2043, that maybe at best has 5 to 15 years left in its operating lifespan. And nobody is really talking very seriously in the Pacific Northwest about that reality. People are just sort of assuming that because it has a license to operate until 2043, that it will continue to churn out 1,200 megawatts of electricity until 2043.
And that it's safe.
Not knowing... What's that? Sorry?
And that it's safe. It's not safe. This plant was only really built to have a life, really. I think it's the exact one that's in Fukushima. So that plant life was really designed for a 30-year operation. Am I correct in that?
I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. But what I do know is that it's certainly not going to last longer than 50 or 52 years. Right. And so one of the biggest things that I've been trying to tell people about in the energy world out here is that we need to start planning sooner rather than later for that closure, because even the most optimistic projections don't place the Columbia Generating Station operating for any longer than 15 years from now.
I mean, imagine that when we think about this, like with them closing this down. And they plan on keeping it open for 40 years. Now, do you mind if I ask you about the Columbia Generating Station? Because that's an issue that, in fact, that's one of the things that I've been really trying to figure out how do we get this plant closed and who do we talk to about closing it. It's almost like an octopus web of they've built it, they've set it up so that it's almost impossible to allow public movement to shut it down. But my question about it is really the safety of it all, because it stores its spent fuel rods up on its roof, just like the Fukushima plant did. Am I correct?
I don't recall actually where its spent fuel is stored off the top of my head.
Well, so this is the thing about this, with all of this spent fuel that is being generated, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but Donna Gilmore from San Onofre Safety, using Holtec's information, was stunned and made this a very big public issue that we actually store our nuclear waste in 5/8-inch thick tanks, canisters, that Holtec, the manufacturer, says start leaking after 20 years. And they can't, once they put the fuel in the tanks, they surround it with a concrete dome so they can't exactly inspect the tanks. So we're like sitting ducks with nuclear waste. I mean, is there no conversation when you talk to people within the environmental movement or even within the industry that acknowledges the inherent risk of how we're storing the waste and the ultimate end result of what are we going to do with it?
No, there really isn't much conversation about that, I'm sad to say. A lot of people, I think, are just assuming that the U.S. government is going to follow through on its many promises to find a long-term repository for the waste, any day now. And I don't think anybody really is thinking about it super more in depth than that. They view it as the U.S. government's problem, and that eventually the U.S. government will fix it and then ship the waste away to someplace that's more safer than where it's currently stored at nuclear power sites. But as we've seen, those promises have been made and then broken, and goals have been made and then not met. And the waste continues to be stored at the sites that it is generated. Another one is at the Trojan nuclear plant site, not far from Portland, right? The waste from that site is still sitting in dry casks there. So, that's definitely preferable to any of the other waste storage alternatives that I've heard. But, No, I would say nobody really in the utility world or environmental worlds are talking very much about the very real possibility of that.
I just find it completely dumbfounding that, well, I guess this is the power of money. I mean, it's almost like every single person who works in a nuclear power facility, the reason they love their job is because they get paid more money than anywhere else than they could get paid. It's about money, even though they know that when they retire, the likelihood of them getting catastrophically ill, or if they have children that are catastrophically ill, they just tend to ignore it. And I'm kind of dumbfounded at you mentioned in World War II how we have sort of were brainwashed to believe that nuclear was our savior, right? The peaceful atom. And I think that's
right.
A large portion of our population are still, this is why we don't have protests in the street. We don't have people, if you talk to anybody, you probably get this. You talk to anybody about this nuclear contamination danger and their eyes roll in the back of their heads and they're like, yeah, next. So,
well, yeah, and actually I think there's a lot of level-headed people out there who know and acknowledge that it's an issue and it's a big problem and a big looming threat. But I think people feel powerless about what to do about it. They don't know how to actually propose an alternative, right? So I think that part of the job of us activists in the world is to provide people with opportunities to share their voice and to advocate for, better solutions for what the situation that we've got right now.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, I think most people understand actually that it is a big problem, but feel overwhelmed by the complexity and the magnitude of it.
I certainly feel overwhelmed by the complexity and magnitude of it. And I've been following this for
Me too.
Since 2000. I started doing this. It was around 2013. I didn't actually actively get engaged and be understanding how serious this was really until after Fukushima happened, and until long after Fukushima happened, when I had a nightmare and I went to the internet. I thought that Hanford was on fire, and I went to the internet and discovered Hanford's fine, but Fukushima's messed up. I actually believed our President Obama, who said everything's fine. So this is the issue, is we're being told by people that we trust and love that everything is fine. And even in our own state of Oregon that has passed laws against having nuclear energy here, Pete DeFazio, Ron Wyden, and Jeff Merkley all signed a letter saying that the NuScale nuclear reactors were a great solution to the climate change problem.
Right. Yeah, that's really a big problem. Is we need to really set the record straight on that one. And it's unfortunately a kudos to the excellent communications department at NuScale Energy, right? That they've been able to sell this, really, it's not a thing yet. It's still just an idea that they have.
Yeah, it is.
And
that's right. It's not
and
like
we haven't actually people to
exactly. We haven't actually seen it work yet.
That's right. But they've managed to get a lot of people to say, "Oh, sure, that sounds like a good enough idea. All right, sounds good." The thing is that hypothetically, there's a lot of things that sound like they're really not that bad if all things were supposed to go according to plan. The issue is that things don't always go according to plan, and there's been a long history of elected officials being really deceptive and untruthful about the nuclear weapons and nuclear power worlds, right? In fact, the very beginnings of the nuclear industry in Washington State was built on deception. The workers at Hanford did not know originally what it was that they were working on. They were told it was a very important effort that would help end the war and bring home the troops, and they were not told that what they were doing was making plutonium for an atomic bomb.
Or that they were being poisoned.
Right. So, and the point that I'm trying to make here is that from the very inception of the nuclear industry in the United States, we, the public, have not been told the full truth of so many of the nitty-gritty and important details of the risks that we are being asked to live with. So a lot of people continue to tell us, "Oh, it's fine, there's no problems," but the risks and the harm that does get done gets underplayed.
It is incomprehensible, though, that we actually have a whole industry of people who are committed to misleading the public. Like this morning, there was a conversation it's about decommissioning the nuclear power facilities, right? And so one of the things that happens with the nuclear cleanup process is they have these beautiful little computer-generated plans that they sell to everybody. But even at Hanford or even at the New Columbia Generating Station, if you actually walk in there and look on site, it's not some clean little neat package deal that they keep sterile. It is literally a catastrophic site that's out of control, that they are hoping nobody know. I think that's part of the secrecy, is they don't want people to know about it. That's why they pay people so much, so that they'll keep their trap shut, because they have a vested interest in, even if they get sick, at least they have a great health care plan that will treat them and or their kids.
Right, exactly. No health care plan is able to cover you from any potential kind of cancer that could come your way. That's really real. And all of the tours of the Columbia Generating Station are heavily curated, very carefully controlled, and members of the public don't get to go on them. It's always something that they will bring local elected public utility officials on these very, very curated tours to show how great this plant is and how safe it is and how nothing could ever go wrong there. And that's the message that they send. And it's all meant to just sort of continue the facade that everything's fine, nothing to see here.
Exactly. Well, it's kind of like these they sent some PDF files for this conversation, because right now the NRC has been asked by the Trump administration to lower its standards and to stop inspections as often as they do. So they are having public comments on, right? And so one of the PDF timelines, that one of the things that came out this morning was a PDF that literally is so incredible. It shows the decommissioning timeline. It's a little square box that they created. And it shows that the operation of a nuclear power facility, it takes 2 years to shut it down. Once you decide you're going to do it, it takes 2 years just to shut it down.
It's a long process.
And then the decommissioning to get back the land to where you can reuse the land is up to 60 years. Which tells me they haven't really decommissioned any land yet, because even the Zion nuclear power plant and the Trojan nuclear power plant here in Oregon, the one that they closed up there, basically they just covered it up with a mound of dirt and said, we're good to go, and it's a park now. That's kind of what they do. They make parks out of these facilities.
Right, exactly.
Which is insane.
Yeah, so this goes back to a term that I used earlier on in our conversation, and that was sacrifice zones.
Yes.
This idea that there are certain geographical areas that we're willing to just sort of sacrifice and say, well, nobody's going to go there. It's too dangerous, or even worse, right, to underplay the actual dangers of being there and letting people come and be there anyway, right, without full awareness of what they might be doing to their health. But the entire concept of a sacrifice zone is something that is a part of this broader just transition framework that is really gaining a lot of momentum and a lot of popularity. And this is a very hopeful sort of ray of optimism that I'll share with you, which is that at least in Oregon, we have this group called the Just Transition Alliance. And that's a coalition of a bunch of different groups, including Oregon PSR, that is working to advance a no nuclear, no fossil fuels energy agenda for the Pacific Northwest that is fair to all of the workers that get displaced out of old industries, and that is not creating any sacrifice zones. Right, that's another of the important values of this Just Transition Alliance, is basically saying, like, we need an energy system that doesn't leave anyone behind and doesn't leave any part of our world, permanently contaminated and uninhabitable. And that kind of thinking, that ideology is really starting to spread. And it comes from the environmental justice movement here in Oregon. It comes from people of color and low-income activists who are have most commonly been exploited by a lot of the large industries that have either polluted their backyards or underpaid their workers, right? And so this is really an amazing thing that's starting to gain some steam, is that communities of color are really starting to bring forward an environmental agenda that more of the mainstream traditional environmental groups are starting to take very seriously and incorporate some of the values of into their own work. And so my, great hopefulness and optimism is that as that ideology continues to gain popularity and continues to spread, more of these mainstream climate and environmental groups will have to, sort of include that idea that, well, no, we're not going to sacrifice any places. And that means necessarily that we can't support nuclear power as part of our climate solutions.
That's actually great to know about. It's called the Just Transition Alliance.
That's right, the Oregon Just Transition Alliance. orjta.org is their website, and you can find them on social media as well.
Awesome.
And they are convened by a number of environmental justice groups in Oregon that are trying to sort of reshape the narrative on what environmental and climate progress should look like in our region. And they're doing really amazing work. It's incredible, some of the policy victories that they've already had. And when the Oregon legislature had a bill this past session that proposed creating an exemption from our nuclear power generation ban, the Oregon Just Transition Alliance leapt into action and immediately started lobbying senators and representatives and telling them that they couldn't support that, and the bill died almost immediately. It was a really impressive effort.
Awesome. Well, Damon, we have about 9 minutes. We actually have about 9 minutes left in our interview. I want to ask you real briefly, is there things that people that are listening to this can actively do to get engaged in putting our energy? Like, my goal with doing this radio podcast is to generate a movement of people who want to figure out how to get involved. So where can people go to actively engage in doing some good work?
I'm so glad you asked. Well, one thing is to, learn a little bit about where you're getting your electricity from. If you live in a place like Eugene or Seattle or Vancouver, Washington, you live in a utility district that is publicly owned, which means that you elect your representatives to the decision-making body of your electricity generation, and you get to have a say there, right? So if you live in one of those areas that's not serviced by a private for-profit electric utility, you should be lobbying your elected representatives in your local utility district and tell them that you don't want to be consuming nuclear power anymore, because those utility boards can then go to Bonneville Power Administration and say, hey, I'm hearing from my constituents that they don't want the Columbia Generating Station. We need to work together on figuring out how we can get rid of that and replace it with a renewable resource. So I would say that is a really important action that anybody living in a publicly owned utility district can take.
So we would contact EWEB. You're suggesting we contact EWEB directly?
Absolutely, yes. Talk to the EWEB commissioners, talk to the EWEB general manager, and generate lots of voices, a chorus of voices that is asking for them to do everything they can to lobby for and negotiate the closure of the Columbia Generating Station. So that's one thing. And then if folks either have already done that or are looking for other ways that they can engage, I would suggest looking for, who are the Oregon Just Transition Alliance members in your region and how can you support their work? Because the more that we lift up that framework of a climate transition that doesn't include nuclear power, the more popular that movement becomes. And that way we get to work both on preventing the public health crisis of climate change and preventing the public health crisis of continuing to operate all of our aging nuclear power reactors. And Eugene, I can suggest a couple of different groups in Eugene. 350 Eugene has a really good working understanding of why nuclear power is not a part of the climate solution. And Beyond Toxics has an office in Eugene. They are a part of the steering committee of the Oregon Just Transition Alliance.
Oh, okay. Well, that's awesome. So, with our remaining minutes left, is there anything else that you'd like our listeners to hear about your work, or what you'd like to impart to them in the last remaining 5 minutes we have on the air?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you asked. So there are a bunch of actions that are happening for a so-called week of climate strikes that are happening later this month, and there's going to be a lot of different actions in various parts of the state and in the country. It coincides with when the Swedish activist Greta Thunberg is going to be coming to the United States. And so this is a really exciting opportunity to be a part of a mass mobilization for the climate. So I would encourage listeners to get involved with an event that's happening in your area. And I would also encourage folks to follow Oregon PSR on our various social media platforms on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and sign up for our email alerts, because we often provide public engagement opportunities for people and on a wide range of issues, not just on climate change and nuclear power, but also on nuclear weapons disarmament and gun violence prevention. So I would really, encourage listeners to get engaged with Oregon PSR's work and with all of the other local actions happening in their areas, and continue having the conversation, continue to stay dialed in.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for joining us, Damon. You've been listening to Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. And this is Damon Motz-Storey, who is the Healthy Climate Program Director for the Oregon PSR, that's Physicians for Social Responsibility. So I really appreciate you joining us. I hope you will come back. At the end of what you just were talking about was the gun violence issue. I'd love to pick your brain about that, because I think that the denial about making good, solid gun protection laws are very closely aligned to the secrecy of the nuclear industry, sort of shoving that also down our throats. So I'd love to pick your brain on that.
Yes, it's a very similar playbook.
I'd love to pick your brain on that the next time you come back, and I hope you'll join us in about a month or so.
I would love to. It's been a pleasure being on the show. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to being on again in the future.
That is so awesome, Damon. Thank you for joining us, and thanks to all of our listeners who are listening to this, and please do take some action. Figure out, Damon gave you lots of suggestions on ways that we can actively engage, and if you're listening to us outside of the Oregon area, these suggestions are still viable and very close to you. All you have to do is go to the internet and let your fingers do the walking, so to speak. So it is going to take all of us, and it's a slow movement. It's kind of like a tsunami, the little tide that comes in that will actually change things. So I really appreciate you, and thank you all for joining us. As I say, put your courage feet on, and we will talk with you next week. Thank you for joining the Age of Fission radio show. Please like, subscribe, and share on Spreaker.com or on the YouTube channel Nutzforart, NUTZFORART. Send all comments and ideas to Lonnie Clark at ageoffission@gmail.com. We urge all, especially scientists and politicians, to follow the words of our beloved American icon, Mark Twain. Always do right. This will gratify some and astonish the rest.